Most companies don't fail because they're outcompeted. They fail because they succeed. It's a bit of a mind-blowing concept, isn't it? These are the companies that grow and scale and attract capital, and then, and sometimes almost imperceptibly, something changes. The mission starts to get diluted, or the company goes in a different direction. Short-term incentives take over. And the very systems that ultimately enabled success start extracting value from these companies rather than creating new value. I'm sure you can relate to this in terms of companies that you have worked for or that you have dealt with in your life. And what's unsettling is that it's not about the people. The people are not bad. It's just that the system is designed that way. And so today's guest, Eric Ries, has spent more than a decade shaping how companies are built. His first book, The Lean Startup, was a monster. It fundamentally changed how founders think about product development and experimentation and innovation. In his new book, Incorruptible, he's taking on something much bigger. He's arguing that the real problem isn't how we build products, it's how we build companies. And his core argument is that most organizations are structurally incapable of staying true to their mission. This is corruption, not in the legal sense, but in the sense of value extraction, and it's the default outcome. And more importantly, he's kind of proposing something radical, that we can actually design companies to resist this, that governance isn't just a formality, it's actually part of the product, and that the most important thing you'll ever build is not the product, but your organization itself. So today we're going to talk about why good companies go bad, what it takes to build a great company that stays great, and whether it's actually possible to scale without losing your soul and your company. I'm J.R. Lowry. This is Career Sessions. Eric, welcome to the show.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to dive right in. Let's talk about Incorruptible. The core argument, as I took it away from the book, is that companies don't fail because the people are bad, but they fail because the systems are bad. And when was the moment that you had that kind of aha moment about that?
So, I've been at this a long time. I've helped a lot of people start companies, and I have personally helped create billions of dollars of personal wealth for founders. Okay. So I'm talking about very significant success. And I have zero jealousy of those people. I'm so proud of them and so happy for them for the success they've had. But I've also had to see the dark side of this. And I'll tell you the story. Working with a friend of mine, someone I really admire, and he just got completely screwed by his investors. It's such a classic story where he was a very values-driven person, built this incredible ethos in the company and made so much money for his investors. And at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. They wanted more. And they were just so focused on squeezing every dollar out of it that they got him out of the company. It's tale as old as time, And he licked his wounds and he went through the trauma of that. And I was there to help him and support him as best I could. But it was sad. I watched it up close. Anyway, he got over it. I'm really proud of him. And he's back at it. He's incomprehensibly rich. What does he want to do with his free time? Does he want to go buy an island and hang out in the Bahamas? No. He wants to get back in the saddle and do it again. He's creating a really mission-driven company with tremendous social promise. So I asked him, given what happened to you, what steps do you plan to take in this next company to make sure it doesn't happen again? Are you considering any governance changes? He looked at me with this blank expression. He was like, what? And the answer is no. He's just going to do the same thing over again. It was really heartbreaking to me. Maybe it'll be fine this time. But I had this really sinking feeling. I was like, this is crazy. But what I realized when I reflected on it later, he has internalized this whole story as his personal failing. That's how the media tells the story. It's like the founder versus the activist, the this versus the that. Who won? Whoever's more savvy is whoever won. The savvy person must be right. So because he's so focused on it as a personal matter, he's totally blind to these systemic forces that he was up against. And as a result, he doesn't even see that he wasn't presented with a range of options of which he selected the best one for him and his organization. He was told, this is the only and best way forward. We have to do better. This is not okay. If we just keep going around and around like this, we're going to keep having this same result, and I can't let that happen.
You talk about a number of things early in the book that sort of set the stage for this. The whole first part is essentially companies that have gone through situations like what you described, and you use a definition of corrupt that's not just about illegal behavior, but about this idea of value extraction. People who are they're looking to take as much value for themselves out of your company as possible, even if it ultimately ends up meaning that the company gets destroyed or that it loses its mission and drifts off into some different form of itself. Why does this happen?
I think that it's very important to call this behavior corruption. And that's not a new thing. Many of the ways that we make money today in the world that are celebrated as legitimate ways of making money, our grandparents would have seen them as not just morally dubious, but they would have been actual crimes. We have legalized so many forms of gambling, of value destruction, and we have locked a lot of investors into this prisoner's dilemma where, since every investor thinks every other investor is trying to squeeze all the money out for themselves, if you don't get in and out first, you're going to be the one left holding the bag. So I think the reason it happens is we have made a civilization level wrong turn. So many of the so-called best practices that we teach boards, leaders, executives, founders, investors, everybody, about how companies should be built, operated, and structured, not only are they not best practices, they're literally value destroying, but we teach them as if they were immutable laws of capitalism or of business or of whatever. And if you can look out the window right now, my guess is you can see a tree older than most of these best practices. They are a very recent invention. And it was shocking to me how much research we have that they're not just inefficient, but actually quite value destroying. So at the same time that we have witnessed the financialization of the economy over the last 100 years, we have adopted this set of best practices that is designed to make organizations weak so that the outside pressure that is growing thanks to the financialization is more and more and more likely to collapse them. To the point now where almost everyone I talk to, they're not startup people, they're not corporate governance people, they will tell me stories about this rapacious behavior. I can't remember who told me this story. I think it was about going to a restaurant, and it was one of his favorite restaurants, but he was like, took a bite of the food. He's like, this doesn't seem right. Something's wrong. And he was with a friend. And he's like, hold on, I'll check something on my phone. I think this restaurant's been bought by private equity. And he pulled it up on his phone. He's like, yep, I could taste it. I've told that story a lot now. Several people have come up to me to tell me that they know what restaurant I'm talking about. And they've each named a different restaurant. And so I call this phenomenon financial gravity, this pressure that companies are feeling to always act in this extractive way. It has blossomed out of the private sector and is now infecting everything. You see it in hospitals, in nonprofits, in governments, in unions, and in universities. And it's an illness. Like we can't ultimately build a civilization that can endure if we're constantly pushing everything into this short-term extractive mindset.
And when you think about some of the examples that have played over the last 20 to 25 years, the privatization of prisons as an example, which seemed like a really great idea and then turned into a completely horrible idea. All the private equity companies buying up care homes and rolling them up and turning them into something less than they used to be, for arguably our most vulnerable population. And it's just all over the place where you've just got this sort of ruthless, overly aggressive form of capitalism that's really taken root. And to your point, we just support this. I think about what I learned in business school back in the early 90s, and it was maximize shareholder value. But it ignores the fact that you've got employees and you've got a community and you've got potentially other stakeholders as well. And in some ways, the people who are like all about shareholder value think that the companies that focus on those other things are stupid. Mm-hmm. And yet that's sort of the argument that you make. You had a lot of great examples in the book. Maybe go through one or two that really get this idea of staying true to mission and some of the things that they've done to protect that.
I had forgotten about this story until just now. For a long time in Silicon Valley, our favorite airline was Virgin America. Richard Branson had an American offshoot of Virgin Atlantic. It was a separate airline. And because of American regulations, he could not be the majority owners. And I happened to be in DC one day having meetings with regulators and academics and all kinds of people because I was working at this thing called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, trying to get it approved. So I had a whole day walking around with my legal entourage and having these grand poobah theoretical discussions like we're having now about shareholder primacy and short-termism. And it was amazing when I was talking to these fancy people. They were utterly contemptuous of the idea that there's a problem that needs fixing. Anyway, I go to check in for my flight, and I happened to be in DC on the day that the board of Virgin America, over Richard Branson's objections, decided to sell the airline. They agreed to a merger that he opposed, what we call a killer acquisition. So anyway, I'm checking in for the flight, and there's all these baggage handlers and flight attendants hanging around the check-in counter. And I said, hey, everybody, I heard there's going to be this merger. What do you guys think about it? And the baggage handler turns to me and is like, corporate greed, once you take a company public, short-term pressure. They just gave me the whole thesis. It was like they were so much more educated than all these fancy people I spent the whole day meeting with. They understood both the human consequences of these choices, which are dire, but also the financial consequences. They were just like, yeah, this is a value-destroying act being done in the name of shareholders for short-term profit. It was really wild to me how many of us normal people seem to understand this really well, yet our most elite people are deeply confused. One of the protagonists of the book is a guy named Saul Price, who anyone in retail will know he is the father of modern retail. because so many of his competitors sprung out of his own ideas. Walmart
Right.
was based on his ideas. Costco is based on his ideas. Anyway, his original concept was called FedMart. And everything you love today about Costco was pioneered at FedMart in San Diego, starting in the 1950s. He had like 20 years of just unparalleled growth. It was like a classic product market fit up into the right story. So he believed that his purpose was to be a fiduciary to the customer. If you're a discount retailer, you are taking financial responsibility for your customers. So quality and discounting was in the blood of the organization that he built. That's why Costco to this day has capped margins. He believed in treating his employees well. He always paid higher than the necessary prevailing wage. Anyway, he was a really good employer and someone who really understood this simple fiduciary commitment. Customers first, employees second, shareholders third. So after 20 years of unparalleled growth, were his investors happy? Were they satisfied? Were they pleased that this ethos was producing these results? No, of course they weren't. They wanted more. They wanted conventional practices. They wanted to raise prices. They wanted to use the trustworthiness that Saul had built to steal this value for themselves. Giving it away to customers made them uncomfortable. This still goes on today. A couple years ago, a Wall Street analyst wrote this about Costco without irony. They said Costco is taking money that rightfully belongs to shareholders and investing it in the customer experience. That's supposed to be a criticism. Anyway, investors didn't like it, and they had the votes to get Saul Price out. So he comes to work one day in 1975, and the locks on his office door have been changed. The critical thing about this story, shareholder primacy claims to be acting in the best interests of shareholders to help them make the most money. And yet in these patterns, when you do the shareholder primacy thing, you often make things worse for the shareholders, not better. FedMart was bankrupt within 7 years. They just utterly destroyed it. So when they fired him from FedMart, he knew he could do it again. And he did. He created a company called Price Club. He took 1 week off, and his new office for Price Club was in the same building as FedMart. He just got the office upstairs and just said, let's go, let's do it again. He did it again. Ultimately, his disciple who came to Price Club with him was a guy named Jim Sinegal. He's the founder of Costco. Eventually, Price Club and Costco merged to create the Costco you know today. And so that's like the clearest, easiest contrast of like, if you build the structures properly, to build this ethos and defend it, you create an awful lot of value in the world. And if you don't, if you insist on the conventional playbook, you will get this golden goose phenomenon.
You make the point for all of the people who are naysayers that Costco had it all wrong, it's massively outperformed the S&P 500.
It's something like 60x over the 40 years since it went public. And what's wild to me, again, it's very important to understand this. We have something that I call the governance class of our society. This is an unelected set of elites who sit on boards, who work at law schools, who are corporate governance specialized judges. It's a very small group of people who decide things like what is the purpose of an organization. These people operate with no democratic accountability, creating rules that have never been subject to any kind of legislative action or referendum. Things like the Revlon doctrine in Delaware, which is a court case. The courts just decided one day that this is how it's going to be going forward. So although people like to blame Milton Friedman for this turn of events, it's not clear to me that Milton Friedman is any more the cause or the symptom of this club just deciding that this is how it should be. So every once in a while, these group of governance experts get together and decide that some company practice that makes the company more resistant to outside pressure is wrong. And so, for example, there was this project called the Harvard Shareholder Rights Project that was going after companies like Costco that had what are called classified boards. This is one of the many defense mechanisms you can have for outside pressure. And a study was done that showed that I can't remember the numbers now, but of the 90 companies that they pressured to do this campaign, they caused something like $100 billion of value loss. Like, it's incredibly destructive, this behavior. But anyway, Costco was in their crosshairs for a while. And it wasn't just the Harvard Shareholder Rights Project. There was a bunch of groups that have tried these attacks on what I call the governance fortress of Costco. And what's incredible about their arguments is that they require you to kind of close your eyes to the actual facts on the ground for the arguments to make sense. Here's the argument. If you don't have the board of directors accountable to shareholders, then management will become what's called entrenched. Entrenched means managers are going to start serving themselves. They're not going to be interested in performance anymore. They're not going to care about their investors. Why is it bad? It leads to poor performance. So I get that. That makes a lot of sense on paper. It just, by the way, it's not a true argument. But if you understand why people would make it in the abstract, and if you had a poor performing company that was also an entrenched company, I get it. But these same people were using the same argument, the same attack on Costco, one of the highest performing companies in the whole stock market. And so it's like this whole debate to me has become almost surreal in the degree to which it has become an abstraction fully divorced from people's lived realities, from our ethical and moral frameworks that are so important to us as a human species, but also to the economic facts on the ground. Like, I think it's become completely unhinged.
I have to ask this question. You've come up in Silicon Valley. You've dealt with a lot of venture capitalists over the course of your business career so far. You can probably name billionaires whose houses you've been to. Do you worry that this turns into a little bit of your own Jerry Maguire kind of moment?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I expect a certain amount of flack and blowback. I mean, I've been getting that my whole career. So, I mean, people thought Lean Startup was totally nuts, and they came around in the end. But it's interesting. I was nervous. Obviously, because of Lean Startup, a big advocate for testing iteration scientific, method, right? So I was like, I can't just write this book by myself in a cave. I got to show it to some people and get some feedback. And of course, the first people I showed it to were all mission-driven entrepreneurs. Okay? It took me a while to work up the courage to show it to some VCs, I have to admit, because I was a little bit worried. And earlier drafts of the book, it was hard for me to get the tone right. Because look, there are a lot of stories in this book that involve investor malpractice. But there's also a lot of stories that involve founder malpractice. So people are like, you think founders should rule the world? I'm like, no, not really. The evidence is really good that there's problems with that too. We're talking about something called the architecture of institutional longevity. What structures can we build organizations to so that they can last for a long time? And that, by definition, cannot be about any individual person because we're talking about organizations that endure beyond the human lifespan. But I was still a little nervous. And I sent it to one of my mentors, someone I really respect, a real Silicon Valley OG who helped build Silicon Valley in the first place. And I wasn't sure what he was going to say. And he didn't read it for a while. And I was like, oh God, he hates it. I was like really bracing myself. And on the day that the manuscript was due to my publisher, I was literally hours from hitting send on the final draft.
Yeah.
He called me out of the blue. My phone rang. I saw him on the caller ID and I was like, oh no, what's he going to say? I was like so nervous. And it was incredible. He was really kind and he was like, this book spoke so much to me. And people have forgotten that Silicon Valley used to have a real mission-driven ethos.
Yeah.
It has been overrun in recent years by these mercenaries who preach profit extraction above all, but they are destroying what made Silicon Valley great. And so it made me feel like he saw this as a restoration of Silicon Valley's true principles. And that was like such a boost to me to be like, okay, it's going to be all right. And since then, a lot of investors have read the book and found it really compelling. So I've been very, very grateful for their support.
So I want to talk a little bit about the Lean Startup, foundational to anybody who's starting a company in terms of how people build products, created the vernacular of MVP, among other things. Now that you've got this new book, Incorruptible, coming out, that's really about how you build companies for long-term success. How do you think about the two? What's the relationship that you envision for the two books?
Well, they are deeply related in a way that I find a little bit embarrassing, okay? Because you mentioned Star Wars. One of the funniest jokes on the whole internet, I think, is this Reddit meme that's been going around for years now. It's Anakin and Padme. 4 boxes. Box 1, you have Anakin. He says, I'm going to change the world. And in box 2, Padme says, for the better, right? And in box 3, you just see Anakin with this grin on his face. And on the 4th box, she says, for the better, right? And I just thought that joke was so funny because like the tech industry, that's so us. We built so many companies that are like, we're going to change the world. And it's like, did anybody specify for the better? After a while, I stopped finding the joke funny though, because I thought it was really obvious that we were trying to change the world for the better. Everyone should know that, right? And I had someone ask me once, well, Hotshot, did you specify for the better in the Lean Startup? And I was like, of course I did. Well, how dare you ask me such a question? And then I was like, did I? And I actually went and got a copy off the shelf. I found that right there on the end of the introduction. It says such and such so that the next generation of founders will have the tools they need to change the world, period. And I didn't specify for the better. And I thought, oh, what have I done? Like I fell into the same trap as everybody else. We were frankly naive. We thought we could build these companies to this mission-driven, vision-driven template. And no one would try to steal it from us. And we were encouraged in that delusion by many, many, many advisors, bankers, lawyers, VCs, of course. So many people were just like, yeah, don't worry about it. It's too early to worry about that. You can always figure it out later. And when something would go wrong, it would always be, if only you trusted the right people. Oh, I've only been a little more savvy. Like it's actually a trap that many of us fell into, myself included. So yeah, I feel like I've been trying over the course of all of my books to create a business culture that is more scientific, more humane, like more rooted in long-term values. And somehow despite my best efforts, like I got sucked into the mania too. So yeah, I think this is a very needed corrective to those mistakes that I don't take full responsibility for, but I take my part for sure.
Ultimately, that meme and what you were just saying, it's like we all make this assumption that you're going to change the world for the better. But I guess it does need to be said.
The reason it's so important to say is when you look at startup Silicon Valley companies, when they're pitching investors, they're like, rah, 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 I am a world-changing, world-eating technology. And then you're like, oh, that's interesting. You're changing the world. You're reshaping the face of reality to your values. Do you have any moral responsibility for the outcomes of your choices? And it's like, oh, no, I'm just a little technology company. I just make databases. It's like, give me a break. Pick a lane, buddy. Either you're a world beater and then man up and take responsibility for your actions, or delegate that to somebody else. Don't go around lobbying the government and changing all this. Like, okay, if you don't want to have moral responsibility, don't expect the upside rewards of all this power. And I think we've kind of seen the worst of both worlds, the socializing of risk and the privatizing of gains, like taking these negative externalities and profiting by them. I think it's something that people should be embarrassed to have profited from, not something to brag about.
So we've got a really timely example of how all of these forces are playing out with AI right now. You talk in the book about how OpenAI and Anthropic are set up as examples to create the public trust. But just look at what happened with Anthropic in terms of its debate with the US government about how the technology can be used. You quote, I've not heard this quote before, but I really liked it. Most fears about AI are best understood as fears about capitalism.
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to play out?
AI is full of uncertainty. And part of the reason it's so interesting is that for the first time in a long time, really high business stakes depend on the answer to empirically testable philosophical questions, which it's always been true to some degree, but it's really wild right now. So for example, everything going on with generative AI as we record this is powered by something called the scaling laws of a technology called transformers. So far, for years now, every time we've increased the amount of computational effort we put into these models, we get a corresponding return in their capability. So if you tell me whether this is an unbounded exponential curve or an S-curve, I can tell you a lot about the future. If it's an S-curve, if you tell me what year it will level off, I will tell you a lot about the future, because this is truly the philosophical state of the art. We are probing the nature of the universe, as much a fundamental attribute of the universe as anything we did in a particle accelerator, okay? If anyone who thinks they know what's going to happen here, they are guessing, okay? Nobody knows. One day, the S-curve will level off, probably. If it's next year or 10 years from now or 100 years from now, really makes a huge difference to all the questions people want to know about what's coming with AI. So yeah, I think the uncertainty we feel is given by the fact that this technology is so unsettling. It's changing our ideas about what intelligence even is. And so many postmodern, abstruse academic theories are going to turn out to be empirically testable. So anyway, it's a really interesting time. Now, to your question about Anthropic and OpenAI, there's something about this technology and its visceral danger that has made this generation of founders much more wary of how it should be controlled. I think it actually has a lot to do with the fact that social media came right before. So many of the actors and investors and players in this drama are veterans of the social media wars. And even though they on public are all talking about how great social media turned out to be because it made them super rich and private, everyone acknowledges social media has been an absolute disaster. As a society, our sense of the truth has been utterly fragmented. And that has not been healthy. Well, those same rapacious companies that control social media, what if they controlled AI? Scary. So I think it is really telling that we've had a big debate about AI safety, AI governance, how should it be governed? I tell the story in the book. I was once doing an event at the Vatican. I was invited to speak on this panel, and it was me and 8 people on this giant panel. And I looked down the row, and every major AI company was there. I think it was Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, Meta, Palantir, Cohere. And I looked down the row and I realized, oh man, there's not a single company on this dais with me who has standard governance. Not one. It's considered too dangerous. No one would feel ethically responsible doing it. It's just absolutely, absolutely impossible to imagine. So I do think that's really important. Now, we've also had a bunch of governance failures already in AI. And obviously the founding of Anthropic had to do with a disagreement with OpenAI about the path forward on AI safety. But I think that the recent experience you mentioned with Anthropic and the DoD, leaving aside who's right, who's wrong, the politics, there's also a very complicated situation. And honestly, I don't even think Anthropic is the main actor in that story. It's mostly a story about government overreach and the DoD. And so to me, it was a very significant thing. Again, regardless of how you feel about the rightness or wrongness of what they did, Anthropic was willing to say, we will turn down $200 million over a point of principle. And you could say they were wrong to do that, they were right to do that, but actually, in our modern world, it is very rare to see a company that can say no to even $1 of extra profit, let alone hundreds of millions of dollars. And in fact, one of their competitors swooped in and grabbed up the contract the second they said no. So I thought that was really notable. Now, when they did that, I'm sure they did not know what the consequences of doing that would be. They've been subject to government retaliation. They've been called a lot of names in public by a lot of very powerful people. I think people are underrating what a big deal it was. They did this without knowing at all what the result would be. But it's also really interesting to me, and I think very validating for the thesis of the book, that they have received all these benefits that they could not possibly have foreseen. I remember someone sent me a video the day after they did it. The whole sidewalk around their entire headquarters in San Francisco was chalked up with messages from the public just saying, thank you for doing the right thing here. That doesn't happen very often with tech companies, even in San Francisco, let me tell you. Claude rocketed to number 1 on the App Store. Like there was this incredible surge of customer loyalty because even when we disagree with them, we admire companies who stand for something. And being willing to stand for something in the face of genuine cost is one of the most important ways to build trustworthiness in a company.
So this book, relative to the Lean Startup was absolutely chock full of great advice for people who are starting companies on the ground perspective. This book operates at more of a system level, right? In terms of how the economy and the capitalist world is set up. But for somebody who's thinking about their career journey, what would you want them to take away from the book that would be helpful to them in terms of how they think about what they choose to do professionally and how they navigate this uncertainty?
I'm really glad you asked this question because although it is true that the first part of the book has this more theoretical discussion, so did Lean Startup. People forget this now. The first chapter of Lean Startup is not about MVPs and pivots, but about the history of management. So I really believe my whole style of writing is to lay a very solid theoretical foundation, whether the reader likes it or not. Okay, I understand a lot of people come to my books and that's not what they're looking for. They just want the practical tools. But I give the practical tools too. So here's my promise to the reader. Every technique in this book is something you can do today. Nothing requires you to wait for some regulatory change or get permission from. They're all actual things you can do today. Every technique is given in theoretical form, but also in story form. Like we have actual case studies of real life companies that have done it. And we have a lot of academic evidence that these techniques work because many of these techniques, although they're new for most readers, they've never heard of this before. I always say, just because it's new to you doesn't mean it's new. But your question about someone thinking about their career as an employee. First of all, if you're a founder and you're in it right now, like if someone's listening right now and you're either thinking of or you just started a company, you can actually just skip part 1 if you need to. Just read part 2. Okay, the book is divided into 3 parts. Part 2 is the blueprint and is just chapter by chapter. Every chapter is specific, actionable techniques you can adopt, and the earlier you adopt them, the better. Not to say that if you're a late stage company, you can adopt them, but the easier, the earlier. If you're not a leader or a founder yet, like you're someone earlier in your career, or you're not sure what your role in this change, I really wanted this book to be useful. I put it in the subtitle, actually. It's subtle, but it's there. The subtitle of this book is Why Good Companies Go Bad and How Great Companies Stay Great, with an ellipsis, with my little nod to Good to Great for those fans of the great Jim College. So there's the why readers and the how readers, and they're both equally important. And people don't realize this. They sometimes say, like, why would I read a book that's for founders? It's like, well, you might be a future founder. And first thing you need to understand is almost all the great founders in this book, the ones who really created breakthrough success that not only made a lot of money, but created this tremendously positive change in the world. Most of them had a pre-existing ethos that they brought with them into entrepreneurship. So if you're that person, you need to be developing those ideas and your understanding now, as soon as possible. Don't wait. But secondly, and this is what part 3 of the book is about, especially the last few chapters, we all have more power in this economy than we think. Part of the magic of late stage capitalism is to make everyone feel disempowered, helpless. This thing seems inevitable and super powerful. But we don't realize this system is obsessed with you, which means every action you take is somebody's OKR. You cancel a service, you buy a thing, you are willing to pay 3 cents extra for the higher quality product. I guarantee you it's somebody's job to notice. You refuse to work at a bad company. You ask the right questions in a job interview, And next thing you know, those questions are being discussed by the board of directors because they're obsessed with getting top talent. And if you have questions, they need to have answers. So there's so many simple, practical, easy things that individual people can do. You don't have to be that courageous even. Just put your toe in the water and see what is it like to lean into this other interpretation of what organizations really are, what business can be. And I have found in my own career and in the many people I've counseled and mentored over the years that this can lead to very surprising change, even if you feel like you are utterly powerless, utterly helpless. So yeah, give it a try. And if you need to, read part 3 of the book first. That's okay too.
I think there is a heavy manifesto component of the book, and that was true of the Lean Startup. And I said to a colleague of mine after reading it over the weekend, I said, this book's going to make a big splash, partly because it's you and partly because I think the ideas are pretty powerful and pretty timely for us to be talking about right now. So I wish you all the best with your launch and thank you for your time today.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, fascinating conversation with Eric just now. Let me just try and boil down a few of the key points. First point is really about this idea of designing your company, not just building it, right? People think about building a great company, but you have to design and make sure that what you're building actually will last. And culture and talent and your personal philosophy, if you're a founder, aren't necessarily enough. You've got to think about ownership structure and board composition and incentives and all of those things, because all of that ultimately will determine whether the company survives in the way that you envision it and whether its mission survives and maybe whether it even itself survives. Second is this idea of invisible drift. We didn't really talk about it explicitly, but certainly some of the examples of companies veering off course. We talked a little bit about FedMark and how that company was really taken away from the original vision and ethos that Saul Price had when he founded it. There's other examples in the book. Johnson & Johnson is one that gets mentioned. That Eric walks through about how it went from a very strong ethos to having lost that ethos, particularly as it related to asbestos and talcum powder and the lawsuits that have happened over that. And so it's important to be thinking about if you feel like you are overly focusing on short-term gains instead of long-term value, this is not a random occurrence, right? This is happening all over the place. And it's a structural signal that the system, maybe your system and your governance model, are pulling you off course. Third is just the important concept of making your mission enforceable, not just aspirational. And again, there's a lot of concepts that Eric introduced in the book that we didn't have time for today, that really allow you to make sure that what you create will last, even last beyond your lifetime as a founder. And there's examples of that he covers as well. And finally is this idea that in some ways, the more likely you are to win, the more likely you may end up being to lose. Success increases risk because it brings the financial players to bear. And so you've got to plan for it early. The more valuable your company becomes, almost the more pressure that it will face to extract that value. So you've got to build protections before you need them. And it's almost impossible to start worrying about this too soon. So those are the key points for founders or people involved in startups. But if that's not you, you should also consider some of the key lessons for Eric's book in terms of the companies that you choose to work for and how you design the trajectory of your career. We talked a little bit about that at the end. Otherwise, you could find yourself working for a company that you kind of feel ends up being soulless and feeling completely uninspired by that. I invite you, as always, to subscribe to Career Sessions on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you found this discussion enlightening, sign up for my membership community, which is called Pathwise, and our newsletter, Path Wisdom. Thanks. See you next time.